Please welcome Donald Davis.
Well, it's lovely to be here. We have just finished the Timpanogos Festival up in Lehigh. This is the 36th year, and I've been part of that festival for 35 out of those 36 years. So I'm a little tired and still just sort of coming off the stage up there. But it's so nice to be able to come down here and just slow down and have sort of a on the porch kind of visit for storytelling. So thank you for being here so very much. I grew up in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. In fact, the land where my father was born and grew up, the land where my mother was born and grew up, that land is now part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So that's my growing up place. I'm a National Park boy. And now we live on Ocracoke Island off the coast of North Carolina, which is inside of Cape Hatteras National Seashore. So we never escape, national parks. And when we come out here, we always spend time, the whole bottom third of Utah is kind of like one big national park all the way through. So we just love being here. When I was a little boy growing up there in the mountains, my Aunt Laura lived with us. She was actually my daddy's aunt, my great Aunt Laura, my grandmother's sister. Aunt Laura never married. She lived with my grandmother till my grandmother died just a little bit before I was born. And since she now had no place to live, Aunt Laura became what my daddy called a floater. She would float up to our house. And she'd be with us maybe a month or maybe 5 weeks. And then one Sunday afternoon, my mother would look at my daddy and say, "It's time. It's time to take her for a ride." And we get her in our Plymouth along with a little sort of cardboard suitcase she had. And we'd ride out to Aunt Esther's house. And we go inside, and as soon as Aunt Esther and Aunt Laura were talking away, my mother would sneak us out the door, and we'd leave her out there. After Aunt Laura had served a term, she would float her down to Aunt Mary's house. Aunt Mary would then float her down to Uncle Frank's house, and then she'd come back to our house. My brother Joe and I loved it when she lived with us. She was the first grown person we ever knew who did not care what we did. It was wonderful. Aunt Laura was the oldest living thing I had ever seen. She wore these long homemade dresses that she made. They came right down to the floor, and they had long sleeves, all year round. That's what she wore, plus a sunbonnet. She had little rimless glasses with gold earpieces. Her face, well, growing up in Haywood County, there where I grew up, is the highest county east of the Rockies. More than half of it is Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Blue Ridge Parkway and Pisgah National Forest. And they tell us growing up there that if you could flatten out Haywood County, it would cover Texas. And when I would look at the wrinkles on Aunt Laura's face, that's what I'd think about. And I thought if you could flatten out those wrinkles, you could put a great big woman back in there. Well, she could get up in the morning earlier than any of the rest of us ever got up. My little brother Joe and I would make a plan at night. We'd say, "Okay, first one up, get the other one up. First one up, get the other one up. We're going to beat her in the morning." And we'd get up and we'd run. We never beat her. No matter how early we headed for the kitchen, she was already there. She'd have the coffee already made in that percolator on the back of the wood stove. She'd have the fire built up till the stove was all hot. A big cast iron pan on the back, ready. As she said, she'd slide it up and cook the eggs if anybody around here ever gets up. I was 5 years old. I could go back and document this now for several reasons. I was 5 years old, and she said that, and I said that one day, and I said, "Aunt Laura, how do you get up so early in the morning?" And she just laughed and she says, "Why, law, son, I reckon I just get up at the crack of dawn. I'd never heard anybody say that. And I said, can you hear the crack of dawn? And she laughed and she said, I sure can. And it wakes me up. And once I'm awake, nobody else can hear it. And then she looked at me and she says, sweetheart, one of these days when I'm dead and gone and don't need it anymore, how about if I leave that to you? And you'll be the one who can hear the crack of dawn. Now, her job at our house was washing the dishes. We did not make her do it till one day she said, my mama didn't do it right. See, the old house we lived in, it was a bungalow house. It actually had started out as a Sears Roebuck kid house. And it had a well in the backyard with a pump on the well. But after my mother and daddy bought that house, my daddy and two of the neighbors went way up on the mountain and they built a reservoir and they ran water down to 3 houses. So we didn't have to depend on those wells anymore. And once we got water down to our house, we borrowed my Uncle Spencer's pickup truck and we went 27 miles to Asheville, Sears Roebuck, so my mother could pick out her first sink. So now she was going to have water. Oh, goodness. It was about this long. It was all, white enamel. A square sink in the middle, sort of a ripply top drain board on each side with a little edge to keep the water from coming off. Drawers under there. Oh, one of those drawers had dividers for the silverware. And then underneath you could put the pots and pans. They got it all hooked up. And my daddy said to my mama, Lucille, try it out now. Try it out. There were 2 handles, cold and hot. My mother turned the one that said cold, and for the first time since the creation, water came out in the house where we lived. She turned the one that said hot, it just kept going all the way around and around. My daddy said, try that one again in the summertime. No, we never did get hot water. We had a water jacket on the end of the wood cook stove. We could get about 5 gallons of water hot at a time. But we never had a water heater. Now, Aunt Laura said, that's a waste of water. You see, the new sink had a stopper. And so my mother, instead of washing dishes in the dishpan and having to carry the water outside, she could now put in the stopper, heat the water on the stove, pour it in the sink, wash the dishes in the sink, stack them up in the rack on the side, and then, even in the wintertime, didn't even have to open the door. She just pulled out the plug and the water went out all by itself. And Laura said, that is not the way to do it. You're supposed to wash dishes in the dishpan. That's why they call it a dishpan, the way we've always done it. And my mother told her she could just do it the way she had always done it. Well, my Aunt Laura was a little short woman, and so my dad had gotten a wooden Coca-Cola crate that he could turn upside down so she could step on it and reach the sink. And she would fill the dishpan up with water and bring it over to the wood stove, put it on the stove to heat up, and she'd be working around, and then that pan would start dancing on the stove. That meant it was ready. And then she'd pick the dishpan up, bring it back over, put the dishpan down in the sink, wash all the dishes, stack them up in a little rack on the side. She had gotten some more water boiling on the stove, so when she got through, she could scald those dishes the way we've always done it. And then, the way we've always done it, she would carry the water out to the edge of the back porch and pour it on the flower bed so it wouldn't be wasted. One night, she went out that door and didn't come back. We heard a big noise and we were running for the door. See, she would go out that door and there was a railing around the porch. And that night, she went too far. She hit the railing just collapsed. She went right down in the yard. The water was everywhere. She was crawling around in the soapy grass because her glasses flew off. She was trying to find her glasses. And see, my brother and I got really excited because Aunt Laura never took her glasses off except to clean them. And she cleaned them with her eyes shut. And so we never knew what color her eyes were. And that night she came back in, and when she had hit the ground, her glasses not only flew off, one lens was missing. We said, we're going to get to see her eyes. But that's the side that had hit the ground. It swelled shut. We never did know what color it was. Well, sometimes at night, after washing all the dishes, she would take us out in the cow pasture to look at the stars. We would go out into our cow pasture. She didn't much pay attention even if we were going to step in something. And if it was summertime, we would put our feet toward the Mahaffey's house because in the summertime, we started with the Big Dipper. In the wintertime, we put our feet toward the Bergen's house because in the wintertime, we started with Orion. And then she would lead us around the sky, from constellation to constellation, showing us how to arc tours, how to spike it, and the names that she grew up learning of all of those it was a wonderful thing, most of the time. The problem is, there in the Smoky Mountains, the really good clear nights come in the flat, dead wintertime. I used to think there were more stars in the winter till I finally figured out if you're shaking enough, you just see all of them. Well, we came back in one of those nights and I said, Aunt Laura, I like to go out there and see the stars, but why do we go so much? Well, the Second World War was just ending. I didn't know anything about that, but of course she did. She said, boys, one of these days, you're going to grow up whether you mean to or not. And when that day comes, sometimes you might have to go someplace you didn't want to go. And if that happens to you, the same thing's going to happen no matter where you go. We said, what? She said, you're going to get homesick. And if you have to go off somewhere you didn't want to go to start with, and you get so homesick your heart hurts, just wait till it gets dark and go outside. And if you know these stars, it'll be like standing right here back at home. And then we'd check to see if we got in something at night. Well, she never got married. I think it was because there were certain groups of people she didn't like. Men. We tried, to help her make acquaintances with maybe somebody her age just for conversation. There was a man who lived up the road from us, Mr. Sarles, and from his wrinkles, it looked like they were about the same geological era. And so we tried to introduce them. He lived in a little house. He had a mule. And he would come down to our house with the mule twice a year. Once in the spring to plow the garden, and then back in the fall to clear out the barn and spread the manure on the garden. He always wore bib overalls when he worked, and he never bothered to button up the sides on the overalls. And he sweated. He sweated a lot when he worked. She would say, a fella ought to sweat when he works every time, but he ought to sort of wrench it off between times. And you didn't have to get very close to him to discover he didn't bother with that wrench it off part. He would come to our house with the little mule. He'd go up and down through the garden maybe a dozen times or so, and then he'd park the mule under an apple tree, and then here he'd come toward the back door. I knew exactly what he was going to say. He was going to knock on the door. Aunt Laura would open the door, and he would say, could I be obliged, please, to have a drink of water? She wouldn't let him drink out of one of our glasses. She would give him a pint jar to drink out of. And when he went home, she'd break the jar. She said she did not want to get nastified. Well, she never got married. And one day I asked my daddy, I said, Daddy, is Aunt Laura not ever going to get married? My dad said, she can't, son, she can't. I said, why can't she? He said, because she's already given her heart away. And you know, if when you give your heart away, you can't just give it away again and give it away again. I said, Daddy, who'd she give it to? He said, it's not a who, son, it's a what. What? He said, don't you know that your Aunt Laura is totally and absolutely in love with dental Scotch snuff? There's not a man on the face of the earth worth giving up snuff to marry. And I knew he was right, because her lip was always full. She would get a big box of snuff at a time, not just a little round tin, and she'd keep it on the dresser in the bedroom where she slept, and that's where she loaded. And I like to watch her load. I would go in there with her, and she'd pick that box up and give it a little shake, and she'd tilt her head back and pull her lip out, and she'd turn the box up and go tap, 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 tap. And then she could eat without getting the snuff. She could sleep with snuff in her mouth. She was just an amazing. And she had a little tin she'd keep in her apron pocket. My daddy said that's kind of her spare gas tank, so she won't run out away from the house. Well, she would not let me taste that snuff. I wanted to taste it because it looked like what my mama made hot chocolate out of. But she wouldn't let me taste it, and that's when I really knew it had to be good, because that's the way grown-ups treat children. They don't give them the good stuff. But one day, in the fall of the year, she was helping my mother and daddy dig potatoes in the garden, and nobody else was in the house. I thought, I'm going to give it a try. This will be my chance. I'll get some out of that big box. She will not even know it's gone. And I went sneaking in her room over there to the dresser. I picked the box up. Ooh, it was a nice, almost full box. I knew exactly what to do. I gave it a little shake to be sure it was all loose. I reached up and got hold of my lip and pulled it out. I tilted up the box and I went, tap, tap. Did you ever watch a dump truck load of sand start to dump? You know, the bed starts going up and the sand doesn't move. It just keeps going and the sand doesn't move. And it just keeps going. And then all of a sudden, all at once, there goes the whole load. That's what the snuff did. It came out of that box. It hit me in the mouth. It went all over everywhere. It was such a shock. I went, not the right thing to do. In a few minutes, it looked like there was furniture moving around on the ceiling that had been on the floor all my life. Well, she got back to the house and saved my life. She got me breathing again, and she helped me clean it up. It was all over that room. She said, son, let me tell you something. If ever again you have to clean up this much snuff, do not use water. There's nothing worse than snuff mud. Just sweep it up and wipe it up, and we'll get the vacuum cleaner. But what are we going to do with this white chenille bedspread? But she got rid of it somewhere, and my mother never knew it ever happened. Well, it was wintertime. My dad worked at the bank in town. My mother taught school. But because they'd grown up during the Depression, we always had a huge garden. We always had chickens. We had a pig. That was our recycling center, the pig was, because it would eat everything we didn't eat, and then we'd eat the pig. We had a milk cow, because what if the Depression came back? So my dad would milk our cow twice a day, 6 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock at night. And it was wintertime. I know about when it was, because the day before we had stopped at the drugstore and we had bought these little cardboardy books that you punch Valentines out of. I was asleep. I thought it was the middle of the night when my daddy came in the dark in the room and he gave a little shake. He said, get up and go to milk with me. He tried to wake up my brother, but he had no success. We left my brother. Now, I would go to milk with him in the summertime, but I didn't go in the winter because it was dark in the morning, it was dark at night, and it was freezing out there. But I got up, even though it was wintertime, because I thought, why does he want me to go? Well, we came down the stairs and got in the kitchen, and there behind that wood stove that stayed hot all night because they kept the fire banked up in it, there was the bucket. In the bucket was his cloth that he wet down with hot water from the water jacket on the end of that stove, squeezed it out in the sink, put it in the bucket so he could wash off her udder. And we headed out the back porch, and we paused on the back porch, and my dad reached up and he flipped a light switch that turned on the light on the side of the barn, which was about 60 yards down the pasture. And when he flipped that light switch on, that's when I knew why he wanted me to go to milk with him. A beautiful ice storm had come through in the night. The whole world sparkled. In that light on the barn back to our house, you could see the ground looked like little sparkly pebbles all the way through. The fence wires, were all coated with ice, big as your fingers. The trees were coated with ice. The white pines, bending down. The forsythia, not quite ready to bud up yet, was sort of mashed down to the ground with ice all over it. I thought, I'm so glad you got me up. This is beautiful. Well, he got the bucket in one hand, got me in the other hand, and we sort of scooted our way out there to the fence. There was a little gate. We had a time getting the lock loose from the ice to get through that gate. And then we got out to the barn where our cow Helen was. And in Helen's stall, because that's where she spent the night, it was warmer in there. My dad pulled out what he called his three-legged stool. It was a little wooden disc that had one leg in the middle. But when you sat down on that one leg, your legs made the other two. And he got that still kind of warm, wet rag, and he washed off her udder. He had already given her some grain to eat. And he never said a word while he milked. I just loved to watch. You could hear those first big heavy squirts just ring in the bottom of the bucket. And then you could hear it build up depth, and it would flatten out to a splat, splat, splat. And you could hear the foam building up on the top, because as he milked it, he hit that foam. The sounds just kept changing, and you could hear right where he was. Finally, he stripped out the last little bit. He stood up and he pushed her by the hip bone, and he turned around to me. I can see him standing there, even in the dark to this very day. He looked at me and he said, Aunt Laura died. That's why he had taken me out there. I didn't get real upset because I knew everything died when it got old enough. And like I said, she was the oldest thing I'd ever seen that was still alive. But my daddy didn't stop there. He said, there will be a lot of people around in the next few days, son. And if anybody says anything to you about it, you say, she just passed away. And then I couldn't figure out what had happened to her. What did passing away mean? She didn't go to school and she didn't drive a car. Those were the only two times I'd ever heard of anybody passing anything. And then I remember one time they talked about Uncle Frank passing a kidney stone. But this didn't sound like that. And as we came out of the barn back toward the house, I thought, is she dead or alive? What is passing away? Is she going to be at the house when we get back? Am I ever going to see her again? We were just passing my favorite climbing tree. It was a huge black walnut tree that came up from the ground, and then it split into two halves. Oh, you could get up in that little crotch, and then you could go way up in that tree. And just as we got to the side of that tree, the whole load of ice from the night before got too heavy for it, and all of a sudden it went crack from top to bottom, and we jumped around, and the first little glimmer of sunlight was coming over the hill above the Bergen's house. It was the crack of dawn. And I'd heard it. And it answered all my questions. Because I knew she had died. She had left it to me the way she promised she would. But the most important thing that I remember down to this very day is not one single day ever starts without my thinking just for a moment about my dear Aunt Laura. We drive up past the cemetery where she's buried, and there is her name right on the gravestone. 1949. I was 5 years old when she died, and I visually remember it just like it was today. I can just see all of that all the way through. When I'm working on stories, I'm always on the lookout, for things that bring back memories. I have what's called the sort of lay term for it is an autobiographical memory. That it has a scientific legal name, but it means I remember very well the places I've been, the people I've known, and the things I have done or that have happened around me. I may not remember, taking German in college or memorizing the periodical table, but it's an autobiographical memory, and that's the way it goes. And when I was in my mid-30s, I was driving through a little town, and beside the road, there was a welding shop. And they had one of those signs on the front that you can change the letters on. And on that sign in the front, it says, "We can fix anything from a broken heart to the crack of dawn." And I read that, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's what Aunt Laura told me when I was a little boy. And that was the beginning place of putting that whole story together. So I started going back and, collecting the other memories and figuring out where does it need to start and how does it need to end up. And it was put together that way. So that was probably that time about 30 years after she had died, because I was probably about 35. I've been telling that story now about 45 more years after that. And it's still a favorite story. That place where we lived, the house where we lived, as I said, my parents had grown up in the Depression. And even though my mother taught school and my dad was the loan department at the county seat bank, they weren't going to live in town. We had to live out in the country the way they had grown up so we could have this huge garden. It was actually a double garden. It was probably about 200 feet long and about 100 feet wide. And the front half was just corn and beans, only corn and beans. And every 2 weeks, my daddy would plant 6 rows of Golden Cross Bantam corn. And it would start coming up 2 weeks later, he'd plant 6 more rows. 2 weeks later, 6 more rows, all the way across, so it would keep coming in all along through the summer. And then when that corn got to be about knee-high, he would go along with the bean seeds. The bean seeds were half runners. And we saved those from year to year to year. They'd come down from my great-grandparents. And so when that corn was about knee-high, he would go along and he'd punch a bean seed in right along about by the base of each of those little corn stalks coming up. And as the corn grew, then the beans would go right on up the corn. And that way, we had that whole garden full of corn and beans. And we would can beans, and we would put up corn, and we would can beans, and we would put up corn, and then we'd can some more beans. And I couldn't figure out, why do they call it canning when it's jarring? The ball jars, that's what we would do. Well, then we had 2 rows of apple trees. And then the garden in the back, it had everything from asparagus to zucchini. We had beets, asparagus, beets, carrots. You just go through the alphabet, keep going right on through there, on and on and on. Over there, then we had peas, we had lima beans, we had onions, we had potatoes. Everything else you could possibly want, that's what we had. One day I asked my daddy, I said, why do we grow zucchini? Because we don't eat those things. My dad said, oh, we grow some zucchini to protect the tomatoes. I said, how did they do that? He said, oh, son, we have such beautiful tomatoes in the fall of the year, in the summer when our tomatoes start ripening. They're so lovely. Somebody comes by and they say, Joe, how about giving me a tomato? Well, give them a tomato and give them about 6 zucchini to go with it, and they won't ask for any more tomatoes. And I kind of feel that way this very day about zucchini. We had chickens. Every year, my daddy would order 72 more chickens. He'd order 6 dozen chickens from the Sears Roebuck Farm and Ranch catalog. And he would change the breed every year so he could tell the ages, of the chickens. One year we get Plymouth Rocks. And then the next year we get Rhode Island Reds. And then the next year we get Domineckers. And that way, as the chickens, got older, and my mother would say, Joe, I've got the water boiling, go get me a chicken to fry, he would kill off the oldest ones. So the young ones would keep coming and laying eggs along the way. That's why we had to have 72 a year, because every week we would have fried chicken at least one time, and it would then run out after a while. So we'd order those chickens. And then one night we'd be sitting at home eating supper, and the telephone would ring, and my dad would answer it, and it would be Mr. Bishop, the postmaster. And he'd say, Joe, the chickens have come. I'm calling everybody. I don't want to go home tonight till everybody comes and gets their chickens. I don't want dead chickens in the post office. Come on down here. I'm going to stay till you get here. And it might be 8:30 or 9 o'clock that night. But I'd get in the car with my daddy. We'd drive into town. All the lights were still on at the post office. We'd go up and open the door, and the whole post office was going cheep, 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 with stacks of boxes. Everybody's chickens had come that day. They were in flat boxes with little holes where they could stick their little, heads out like that. And we'd take them home, where my mother would have fixed a big corrugated cardboard box in the kitchen floor where she had suspended a 40-watt light bulb for a mama. And she put, some chicken feed and some water in there, and we would just pour those little chickens, 1 dozen after another. Actually, they'd send you 14 or 15 for each dozen in case some of them died on the way. So we got a whole lot of chickens. And they would, that first night, I don't know how they learned to do this, but they would turn the feed over into the water and then poo in it all night. So the next morning it smelled so good when you went in to eat breakfast. Well, they would live there in the kitchen until they got big enough to have enough real feathers to fly out of the box. And when they got that big, they would go outside and join up with the rest of the chickens so they could lay eggs, and then we could eat them on Sunday. I used to just love going out there with my daddy when my mom would say, Joe, go get a chicken. The only thing he would say was, how do you want to cook it? I want to fry it, because he was going to bring it back ready that way. And we'd go out the door. My mother would bring the boiling water. My daddy and I would catch the chicken. We'd go back to the chopping block. And the chicken's neck would go on that chopping block. Chop. Throw it on the ground. And that chicken's head on the ground would tell the rest of the chicken which way to run and flop to hide under our little woodshed. So I could crawl under there and pull it out. Many years later, I was visiting at home, and I went out with my dad to kill a chicken. And when he killed the chicken, he put it under a tub and put his foot on the tub till it just flopped around in there, and quit. I said, why didn't you do that when I was little? He said, if I'd done that, you wouldn't have got to crawl under the woodshed. So my dad planned everything. Then we'd scald the chicken. We'd pick out the feathers, light some newspaper, and singe the little pin feathers that you couldn't pick out, and then clean the chicken. Its head and feet would disappear to go to some head and foot chicken land. And then my dad would carefully cut up the chicken for my mother to fry. And it would take 20 minutes. He'd be back inside with chicken that, guess what, tasted like chicken. we had a pig. That pig, I never heard the word recycle, but when that word was invented, first thing I thought of was the pig. Because like I said, it ate everything we didn't eat, and then we ate it. One night we were having pork chops, and my dad cut the fat off the edge of his pork chop, and he picked it up on his knife, and he said to my mom, he said, "Lucille, reckon how many times we've eaten these same pork chops?" Because that part went in the slop bucket, and the pig went around and it came back out again. Yep. We always had that milk cow named Helen that I told you about. My dad did not name her Helen. She had that name when he got her. And he said, you just can't change somebody's name. Her mama named her Helen, so she's going to be Helen for the rest of her life. The reason my mother didn't like that name was we only had one neighbor in visible distance, old Miss Bergen. She lived on the other side of our garden, and guess what her first name was? Helen. And my daddy would go out to milk. Our cow pasture ran up behind her house. And Mrs. Bergen would be sitting on her back porch in a rocking chair. My daddy described her as a right fleshy woman. And he would go up there and he would look around to see if my mother was listening. Because if my mother wasn't listening, he wasn't going to do this. And all of a sudden, with Miss Bergen sitting on the porch, he would go, "Oh, Helen, Helen, I'm ready. Come meet me in the barn." Mama said, "Joe, you stop talking like that right now. Miss Bergen thinks you're talking to her." "Oh, if she can't tell she's not a cow, I can't help it." Because my daddy's hobby was called annoying my mama. Well, we would put up food and put up food and put up food and put up food. The potatoes would be dug and they'd go in what we called the basement, but it was kind of a little hole under the kitchen. And then the onions would go in there and the carrots would go in there. But then the okra, we just canned stuff forever and ever and ever. Now, when I was in the second grade, something happened that changed my mother's world. It came out of North Carolina State College through the county extension program. Every county in North Carolina built a cooperative community shared cannery. It was a little building built on a concrete slab, built out of what my dad calls cinder blocks. Everything in there was steam powered. These big steam cookers, huge steam cookers. And then a processor and a sealer. Because, see, if you went over to the cannery, you put things in actual cans. Mrs. Seiler, who ran the school food program in the wintertime, she ran the cannery in the summertime. And now my mother could take 2 bushels of beans at a time. She could take as much corn as she wanted to and cut that corn off and just freeze it, cut off the cob. Can it cut off the cob like that? She would put up beets. One time she and her sister Eddie had an all-out chicken killing. They killed a dozen chickens at one time, and they went over there and they canned chicken meat. They canned everything. The deal was you got these cans, and they were a penny a can, unless you were canning something acidic, and then you had to pay a penny and a half a can because those cans were lined on the inside, so whatever, like tomatoes, wouldn't interact with the galvanized can. So we would go over there. My little brother and I would go to help my mama, and we'd take maybe 100 ears of corn. We'd take all those beans. That's most of what we did. And we get over there and my mother would say to me, she'd say, "Now, you take your little brother outside so he won't get scalded to death on the steam." I didn't want to do that. I'd never seen a child get scalded to death on the steam. I wanted to see what that looked like. But she made me do it. That's what I had to do. But I had one little job at the end. They'd process all that food. They'd put it in those empty cans. They'd put a blank lid on top. And then they'd send it through the sealer processor, where it would be way heated up, and then those lids would be sealed down, on the can on the bottom, and they would come out the other end just like cans you bought in the store. Except for one thing, no label. Every can looked like every other can. So here's where my job came in. Way down there where the cans came out, they had a whole big rack of rubber stamps. They had every possible thing you could put up in a tin can, and stamp pads. And so after the cans came out, you let them cool down a little bit, because if you stamp them when they're real hot, it would just smear. And then I got to stamp the lids. And there was also a date stamp. So we'd stamp the lid like beans, and then put on the date, August 15th, 1952. Whatever it was, going right down through there. That was my job. Well, one day my dad came home from work, and he came in and said, "Lucille, I was listening to the radio on the way home, and tonight we're going to have a freeze." The first freeze of the year, about mid-October. See, at the end of the summer, the cannery dropped back to just Saturdays, because most of the garden stuff was gone. And then maybe by the end of October, it just closed down for the winter. So my dad said, "Lucille, you better go out there and get everything out of the garden that's possibly edible, because it won't be good tomorrow after a big freeze." And I helped my mother. We went outside. We got beans. We got corn. We got okra. We got tomatoes. We pulled up onions. We didn't even need to do that. We got some potatoes. We got some carrots. We even went up and down a row of apple trees, and we picked up all the apples on the ground that had fallen off the trees so far, and we brought all that stuff back inside. We had lima beans. We had field peas. We grew everything. And my daddy looked at it, and he said, "Well, you've got a whole lot, but you don't have much of anything." And that's what we had, a whole lot, but not much of anything. He said, what are you gonna do? She said, "I got it already figured out. Tomorrow is Saturday, and I'll take the boys with me, and we're going to take all this stuff over to the cannery, and I'm going to make soup mix. We'll put it all together. And then in the wintertime, when it's cold or when we're in a hurry, we could open one of these cans of soup mix. We might add some meat to it, or we don't even have to add meat to it. And we're going to have wonderful vegetable soup in the wintertime." And then my daddy looked at all those apples. He said, "I've never had vegetable soup with apples in it." She said, "I'm not going to put the apples in the vegetable soup, silly. I've got enough apples to make a small run of my good spiced applesauce." Now, folks, we had heard of her good spiced applesauce, but we'd never tasted it. Because it was too good to eat, we had to give it away. And then we had to eat this old greenish-looking applesauce that didn't have a grain of sugar in it, and the whole mess. But she made it, and it had cinnamon in it, and it was dyed a little bit with some red dye. Oh, it's just beautiful. I just wanted to taste it so much, and I never got to, because we had to give it to people. So we headed over there on Saturday. Miss Seiler was there. My mother was the only one who got there first thing in the morning, and she and Miss Seiler started working in there, shucking corn, cutting the corn off, stringing the beans, breaking all the beans, getting everything ready, cutting up the okra, cutting up the tomatoes. And I, as she said to me, "Go outside and keep your little brother out there so he won't get scalded to death on the steam." That's where we went, outside. Now, where the little cannery was, it was on county property, so it was behind the high school, right where the bus went up to the school bus garage. And the little road that went up to the school bus garage was gravel. And on the other side was maybe a 2-acre little pond. And anybody with reasonable good sense could look at that pond and tell it needed to have rocks thrown in it. And right there was a whole road made out of little rocks. So we proceeded to try to move the gravel road into the pond. Oh, we were just throwing and have a wonderful time of great. Once in a while we'd get one flat enough that it would skip. Mostly they were just round crusher run rocks, and they'd just flop down in the water. We were having a great time. And my mother came to the door, and she looked out, and she said, Donald, bring Joe with you. In a few minutes, the soup mix just went through the processor, and it's coming out at the other end. It's too hot right now, but wait a few minutes and then come around to that other door so Joe won't come in by the steam. And stamp the lids on it, stamp them for soup mix. And I said, yes, ma'am. And we kept throwing rocks. Well, throwing rocks will make the time pass. And it didn't seem like we'd been throwing rocks all that long. Till my mother came and opened the door again, and she shouted out to us, I'm just about to send the applesauce through the processor. Did you stamp the soup mix? Now, I'd known my mother most of my life. And I knew the kinds of things that she liked to hear and the kind of things that she did not like to hear. And I knew she did not want me to say to her, no, ma'am, I ignored every word you said, and I wasted a good hour of my life throwing rocks at. She didn't want to hear that, now did she? And so for her benefit, I said, yes, ma'am, I did it. And she said, oh, good. Well, just in a few minutes, come on around and bring Joe around there so he won't get scalded. And stamp the applesauce. Well, we waited a few minutes, threw some more rocks, and then I took him, and we went around to the other end of the building, and we came in. That's right where all the cans came out. And there was a whole raft of cans, beautiful silver cans. Every one of them looked like every other one. And I said to my little brother Joe, I said, you're going to need to help me. He said, what? I said, how about helping me stamp the lids on these cans? He said, oh, yeah. Oh, boy. I said, about half of them are soup mix. About half of them are applesauce. I'll stamp the soup mix and you stamp the applesauce. And we got those stamps and we went down through there side by side. You know, we just stamping soup mix and applesauce till we got them all done, and then we put the dates on them, and then we separated them. You know, we separated the soup mix from the applesauce because we could see on the cans what was in there. And my mama loaded them back in the boxes that the empty cans had come out of when she started all that, and we headed home and we put all that stuff down in the basement. Everything was fine till about December. We went to the Methodist church. My daddy would never miss a Sunday going to church. Never miss. He loved to sing. That was one of his reasons. He loved to sing. But he had another reason. We would get in church. My little brother would be here. My daddy here. My mama here. I'd be there. And the sermon would start. And my daddy would start listening to the sermon. And his lower jaw would never move. But as the sermon went forward, the rest of his head would begin to lean back. And my mother knew better than to touch him, because if she touched him, he would say, I'm not asleep. She'd just leave him alone. And then when the last hymn started playing, he'd wake up. Now, there were 3 perfectly good escape routes out of that church. But my daddy always had to take us on the one that went by our minister so he could shake hands with him. And here we go. My daddy, my mama, me, my little brother. My dad would get up to our minister and he'd shake his hand and he'd say, "That was fine." He's talking about his nap. And then he'd say to our minister, "Why don't y'all come home and have Sunday dinner with us?" And my mother's back there going, and our minister could read body language. And he would say, "Oh, thank you, Joe, but we've already got plans for the day." Well, in December, one Sunday, we had a guest minister, a guest preacher. And my daddy got a long nap that Sunday because, if they're not coming back next Sunday, they don't care how long they keep going. And so he had this long nap, and we started out through there by the guest minister, and my dad got up there and he shook his head and he said, "That was fine. Why don't y'all come home and have Sunday dinner with us?" And that guest minister didn't know who that crazy woman was back there having a fit. And he said to my daddy, "Thank you, we would love to." And up to that moment, we didn't know there was a we to it. But he had a wife and 3 underfed children back there on the back. And my daddy told him all this complicated stuff about how to find our house. And I thought, it's real easy. You just go right up there. But my daddy was sending them all over the place and everything. I didn't realize what his plan was. And we got out there in the car, and all my life, I'd heard my mother talk about how if you did not get your tetanus shot and you stepped on a rusty nail, you could get lockjaw. And as soon as we got in that car, I thought she had lockjaw. What in the world did you do that for? My daddy said, "Calm down, Lucille, calm down. This is what you've been waiting for. Remember all that stuff you put up at the cannery? We'll get home. Go get some of that chicken that you and Eddie put up. Make some chicken dumplings. I know you can do that in no time. Get a quart of green beans and bring them up here. Oh, go get something else. I know you put up some beets and something like that." And sure enough, the way my daddy had told them how to find our house, by the time they got there, my mother had Sunday dinner ready. Well, we sat down and we ate. And we ate, and we ate, and everything was just fine. Just fine. Till my daddy said, "Lucille, that was good. What's for dessert?" I was about 9 years old, and we hadn't had dessert in 27 years. And my mother said, "I know what, let's have some of my good spiced applesauce." She said to me, "Go down in the basement and get some." And I went on the back porch and I went down those steps to that place we called a basement. And sure enough, I got a can, said right on the top, applesauce. And I brought it upstairs, and as soon as my mother put the can opener on it, and the can opener went like that, it didn't smell like applesauce. And we opened it all the way up, it was soup mix. She says, "Oh, son, something got messed up. Go down there and get another can." And I brought another one up, and we opened it. It was soup mix. We opened 7 cans of soup mix in a row before she said, "Go down there and get one that says soup mix." And we finally found the applesauce. We had soup every night for a week after that. Because, of course, we couldn't waste food. That was it. Well, the next Sunday, we headed back to church. Our regular minister was back again. My daddy had his normal nap. And as we came out that Sunday, my mother, who usually followed, a little, she was right up behind him. And he stuck out his hand and he said to our minister, "That was fine." And at that moment, my mother jerked down to the back of his coat. And my daddy said, "See you next Sunday." And he never again invited somebody to come home with us for dinner unless he had applied with her about 2 weeks ahead of time. That's the way it was. Okay. Thank you. All stories are about the same thing. They're really about the same thing. Let's think about this. When you wake up in the morning, before you get up, don't you already kind of think you know what's going to happen that day? And you start off into the day, and if the day really happens the way you thought it was going to happen, there's no story. And that's why at night, when you say to the kids, "What happened at school today?" What's the answer?
Nothing.
Nothing. Because nothing means what happened was what I already thought was going to happen. There's no story there. But some days, we get up in the morning and we start off into the day, and something comes sneaking around the corner and it turns that day upside down. And every time we have a day like that, we've got a story there. See, I did not wake up that night when my daddy came in my room thinking, today's the day Aunt Laura dies. No, that came around the corner, turned my whole life upside down. You know, I did not go to church that particular morning thinking, today's the day I'm going to get caught for the way we step. No. That came around the corner and it turned the world upside down. So if you start paying attention as days go along one after another, every time you find a day when something you did not know was going to happen turned your day upside down, there's potentially a story hiding there. And the thing to watch out for is when we get turned upside down, we're not adults in that moment. We're children again. Because if we are faced with something we've never been faced with before, we're 10 years old all over again. So, you know, if you think about your mom has lived in the same house, your mom's lived in the same house, 69 years, 70 years, and now is she going to get to stay there? Well, she's acting like a child. Why? She's never had to do that before. She is a child again. So that's part of what makes the stories funny, because we're going back to that laughable past, you know, of childhood, no matter what age we were when it happened. So let's see if you have comments or questions you want to ask about anything. We'll spend a little time here. I can't see you very well, but we'll figure that out.
Go to the microphone. So
Yeah,
we can
if you go to the microphone, I'll
record it for
we'll know.
posterity.
Okay.
Anybody online?
I guess we won't go to the microphone.
Hi.
Yes.
Very good stories. So, when did you start telling stories?
When I was a child growing up, it was before television. We didn't have television. Many people didn't have cars. No one in my mother's family ever drove, you know, in her ancestral family ever drove. We would go out to see my grandparents either Saturday or Sunday afternoon every week. When we asked my daddy why we went so often, he said it's because they don't have a telephone. They can't call and tell us they're dead. So we have to go check and see if they're dead. And so every time we go, we'd say, let's go see if Grandma's dead. Let's go. But we would go out there. It was a big log house way back in the mountains. And there was a big porch on the front. There was no electricity, so there were no lights to turn on when it got dark. There was no running water, but there were relatives. My mother was the oldest of 9 children. My dad was number 8 of 13 children. And we'd eat, and then we'd go sit on the porch and talk. And what I remember as a little boy was how much I just loved listening to the old people talk. Because they were telling about people they had seen since the last time we had been together. That we're talking about places they had been since the last time we'd been together. And then they were telling about those days when the world turned upside down that they never expected. And those were the stories we'd hear over and over again. And gradually, without noticing, darkness would fall. And it was so warm feeling to be sitting there in the total dark where you could see way out there in the country absolutely nothing, but still be surrounded by those soft voices of relatives telling the stories. And I would go back to school because in those days we didn't have PE, we just had recess, which meant let them out and let them do what they want to. And I would gather up a bunch of kids under a big oak tree for recess and tell them stories I'd heard at my grandparents' house. And then pretty soon on Mondays they would say, did you go out there this weekend? Did you hear some more stuff? And so I started, they weren't my stories, I was retelling stories I heard. Retelling what I heard. But gradually then, as people would ask questions, a question that somebody would ask, the answer would be the beginning place of a new little story. So I went off to college, and I would tell those stories to friends in college, but they didn't have the setting. So I'd have to describe the place where I grew up. They didn't know my relatives, so I'd have to bring them to life. And so now they were becoming my stories. And then gradually, I began to just discover more and more of my stories. One of the very first things I did was I got a call from the Smithsonian. And it was from Folklife. And the person said, we're having a symposium. We're collecting dog stories. And one of our staff members said, so you have a really good dog story. I thought, what's he talking about? And then I remembered a little bit before that, I'd been at Berea College in Kentucky at Christmas time for Christmas Dance Week. And there was a storytelling class, and in that class, I told a story about my Uncle Frank's magical hunting dog, his magical foxhound, which they had torn a barn down, and under where that old barn had been for years were some dried up 60-year-old fox tracks. And that foxhound started chasing the smell of those tracks that were 60 years old. And 30 minutes later, they eventually find the dog in a used clothing store in Baltimore, Maryland, barking at an old worn-out fox fur coat. But all kinds of things happen along the way. And that's a story I heard my Uncle Frank tell. Well, somebody from that Folklife Smithsonian staff had been at that dance week and went back and said, call me. Well, once I did that, I got up there and told that story, and they said, do you have any more stories like that? And I ended up spending 2 days there doing that. And then getting back home, the phone would ring, and it would be somebody saying, I was at the Smithsonian when you were recording all those stories. I'm in the folklore department at University of Indiana. Could you come up there? And so it grew one thing at a time. I have never asked to go somewhere and do anything. Everything I've ever done has been what someone else has asked me to do. So at that point, I was full-time a United Methodist minister. I was asked the next year to tell stories at the World's Fair in Knoxville. And I did that for the opening week and the closing week. And the year after that, I was invited to tell stories at the National Storytelling Festival. Wow. And so I kept doing that for 7 years, and then I retired from the church because I'd been in the church work for 25 years. And so for the last 30, how many years it's been since 1989, I've been traveling full-time doing storytelling. So people would come up and say, your story about Aunt Laura, for example, reminded me of my grandmother. Do you teach workshops? Well, there were no workshops, and there was no material for workshops, so it had to be created. So I began to do that, and then out of that came a little book called Telling Your Own Stories, another little book called Writing as a Second Language. And then I started realizing that I didn't want the stories to get lost, so we started doing recordings. First thing I did was 7 LP albums before we even got to cassettes. And then, of course, to CDs, and now it's flash drives. I did about over 50 of those recordings, and I've just released last year the 19th book. So it's been like walking backwards through life, because if you're walking backwards, you don't know where you are till you passed it. You know, now I look back and see, oh, this happened and then this happened. It was just totally organic. It nourished itself and grew on its own. So we travel now. We drive everywhere unless you have to fly across water, because we love doing that. We've been on this trip for 4 weeks. This is our fourth week or fifth week. We've got 5 weeks to go. So we have 2 more storytelling festivals on the way back toward North Carolina, and then another performance in North Carolina. And then we're home for a week before we leave again. So we did that. Yeah. Is anybody else back there?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
When you were a minister, what did you think about the fellow in front of you whose head was going backwards all the time?
Well, here's the true thing about it. You know, I went off to college, and I kind of forgot about all those stories I'd grown up with, besides telling them for fun here and there a little bit. And then by the time I got to seminary, that was so much a head trip. And I came out of seminary and started preaching the way I'd been taught at Duke Divinity School, and watching people fall asleep. And every Sunday, Bruce Abercrombie would fall asleep first. Now, Bruce kind of had an excuse, because he was the police chief, so he had probably been up most of Saturday night. But after Bruce would go to sleep, then Carl Roberts would go to sleep, and then Bill Koger would go to sleep, and then Doyle Lakey would go to sleep. Finally, Betty Hunsucker would go to sleep. I had 4 men down before I got the first woman down. So, but because I was preaching the way I was taught in seminary, and it was head stuff, you know, it was just head stuff. And then what would happen was, because I was the minister, one of the church members would say, would you do the program at Kiwanis Club next week? And of course I'd agree, because they were one of my church members, and then I'd forget about it. And so next week, one morning, the phone would ring, and it would be my church member saying, you're doing the program at Kiwanis Club today. I'll pick you up a little bit before 11. And the only instructions were, be sure you let us out about 5 till 12 so everybody can get back to work. And I thought, well, I wonder what I'm going to do. And the stories came back. So I told that first time at Kiwanis Club, I told that whole long story about my Uncle Frank's foxhound. And when I got to the end of it, I said, now I know I'm supposed to stop now so you can go back to work. And they said, oh, we don't need to go back to work. Tell us another story. It's okay. You don't have to stop now. And so that was the beginning. I was a slow learner until I learned to work with using stories in preaching. And once I learned that, then people were not only awake, but the church began to grow enormously. So I was in the local church for 25 years till I retired to do this full time. And I teach some seminars now on preaching with stories, you know, working with stories, preaching. We have a new minister at our church on the island, and I've been assigned to be her mentor for the year. And so a lot of what we're working on is the shape of worship and real long-term preparation for preaching, so you can actually find the stuff you need along the way. So I'm still partly in that world. Thank you. Should we stop, Don?
If there's more questions.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah,
Great.
I just wanted a comment first, just about the workshops. A few years ago, you did a workshop here, and that was just really, really lovely, so thank you for doing that, and maybe we can get that again one year. And then, I guess I do wonder, I love how you talk about where stories come from. I noticed that you usually, not always, but you usually tell stories from your childhood rather than other stages of life. I'd love some commentary about those choices.
Well, that's where we started. That's the place where we started. And if I'm trying to get stories, not about let's think about it, stories about let's feel it. It's all about feeling. And so that's where our world of feeling started. The problem is, in childhood, we very probably had someone else who thought it was their job to write our life story. They were called parents. And the whole process of growing up is the process of our parents gradually learning that it's not their job to write our life story, it's their job to help us find our own. And so, see, that's where the heart of our stories come from and come out of that struggle along the way. We're kind of born on one end of seesaw, where when we're born, our first question, it's not verbalized, but the first question is, who am I? But we don't ask it that way. The way Zenith is asking that question is, with whom am I? And it's not being verbalized because Zenith's not old enough to verbalize it. But that's what's happening inside the heart. It's, who are these people? And so that's the first identity we acquire. It's not who am I, but with whom am I? And we work on that for years of childhood. We work on that. And about the time we really get hold of it, we are sick and tired of it. That's called adolescence. Because adolescence, we don't want to be with those people. We want to go seek our fortune. And so we start breaking away, trying to go seek our fortune, moving this way to the other end of the seesaw. And one of two things happens. We either acquire the fortune we went after and discover, hey, that wasn't the big deal I thought it was going to be. Or we discover, I'm never going to get there. I might as well try something else. And at that point, there's only one way to go. It's to turn around and go back. And so we're heading back toward identity, but this time, instead of saying, with whom am I, now we're saying, who am I really? Who am I? So children are down here on this identity end, where grandparents, they've gone back down there. Where parents, the common enemy, they're way out here seeking their fortune. Which is why grandchildren and grandparents get along so well. Because they know identity is more important than fortune. And so that's my starting place. This year in the workshops, we do 5 week-long workshops a year. I do 2 on the island where we live, if you want to know about that ever. And we do 1 in LaGrange, Georgia. I do some more for a private foundation. And the first question I started off with this year, and you can go home and think about this as you go to sleep. Thinking about childhood, I want you to think of 3 smells you remember from childhood. And then tell us the story, the little story of each of those 3 smells. And the stories could have gone on for a week just coming out of that. Because they kept going and kept going. And then what happened is, when we heard somebody telling about their whole experience of popcorn smell, we have 4 other people thinking of their own memories of that same smell, and they grew and grew and grew and grew and grew that way. So then we're ready to start down there and start moving forward. Does that begin to make a little sense? Okay. The other reason I do that, now I have plenty of adult stories, but I'm more than anything else a festival teller. And when I'm at a festival, it's like a Disney World audience. It's kids, parents, and grandparents. At the Timpanogos Festival, you've got kids who are too little to listen, who are playing on the edge, and they're listening anyway. They just don't look like it. And then we've got their parents, and then we've got the grandparents. And the one place everybody has been is called childhood. So that's why in festival settings, those are the stories that really pull everybody together. Yeah, that's why I do that.
I've got a question.
Okay.
I really enjoyed hearing how your stories build and become larger to begin with. I'm wondering about the ending, because you're do the stories change as you tell them? I mean, like, you've been telling this story for 36 years.
Oh, yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
different there. And I'm wondering about editing, because your stories are so concise, engaging, and I'm wondering how that comes about.
I put the story together to be told in a live festival audience. That's the reason it's put together. And the reason, and since that's what it's put together for, nothing gets written down. Because this is not a story to be read, it's a story for me to tell with a live audience with whom I'm playing all the way through. I'm playing with that audience. After I've told that story, I say jokingly 50 times, but a bunch of times, then I'm ready to record it. When I record it, even if I do it with a live audience, it's different. Because if I'm in front of you, I can say, when I was about this old. If you're listening to a recording and you hear the words, when I was about this old, it's absolutely meaningless. So I have to record it with an awareness that even though I'm telling it to a live audience, there are going to be people who hear this who do not see me. So that's the first preservation step. And then the last preservation step is writing a version for publication. And that's different also because somebody who reads one of my books, they don't know who's telling the story. And they can't ask me any questions. So I have to explain who the narrator is a lot more. And not explain directly, but I have to ease that in and work that in. And I have to anticipate every question that anybody could ask. So that story that's written for a reader is way too big to tell. When I'm telling the story, the moment I hear laughter, I don't even need to finish the sentence. I can start the next sentence because that laughter says to me, I see it. Humor is not punchline. Humor is recognition. And whenever you laugh in my story, you're saying to me something like, my mama was like that. Or I did that to my brother. Or I know somebody that happened to. And so when I'm telling the story, I'm playing it. I'm playing it with the audience. When I write the story, I write it, give it to the editor, and I don't want to see it again. Because if I look at those words I wrote down, there's danger that I might say them. And they're not the right words. They're the right words for somebody to read, but not for me to say out loud. Did that have anything to do with the question, or did I ignore the question? But the other thing that's changed is I change. Because I've been doing this now, 9, 10, 20, at the National Festival, the 1st of October, it'll be my 45th year to be a feature teller there. So I'm 45 years older than when I first told about Aunt Laura. So I've changed. The world has changed. Things have to be described differently. I have to work with more care in some kind of ways. I have to explain some things more fully. There are stories that I used to tell 50 years ago that I don't tell anymore because they've had their time and they're ready to go to bed and stay. Sometimes they come back later. But it all changes. It's not a dead thing. It's a vibrant, living thing all the time. Just all the time, all the time. Yep.
come from a family of good storytellers? Was anyone else in your family, did they have an autobiographical memory?
My Uncle Frank was the wonderful family storyteller in my dad's family. Almost everything he told was a tall tale. But a lot of them would have very universal themes. You know, they had come from there. So I don't know about his memory. I don't know that. I know that he died when he was only 68 years old. And one of the things I did right after he died, because people in the family would say, oh, don't we wish we could remember those stories that Frank used to tell, was I sat down and just made a list of all the stories I could remember that he told, and I came up with 43 stories, and most of those stories ended up in a little book of mine that's called, guess what? Barking at a Fox Fur Coat. Because that dog story I mentioned was the title story in the book of all those stories. In my mother's family, my grandmother was the storyteller. She did not tell tall tales. She told mostly jack tales, which are traditional stories from the British Isles. You know, Jack and the Beanstalk. You know, Jack went up the hill with that girl to get water and fell down. You know that. And you know when Jack almost set his pants on fire, jumping over the candlestick. Well, there are thousands of stories about Jack. They're the everyman story from the British Isles. They're like Brer Rabbit stories in slavery in the South, about Nazi stories in Africa, about Iktomi stories in the Navajo people in the Southwest. That's that Boots is the main character in Scandinavian stories. And the themes are the same. The themes are the same. The themes are the same. There's a whole Jack tale in which the whole theme of that story is the same theme we find in King Lear. So those were the kind of stories she told. And so I used to tell a lot of those stories, but they're not stories that festival audiences really jump onto. So mostly I've done several books to be sure they don't get lost. And I tell them in folklore departments in universities, because they're the people who are working on that stuff. Yep. Okay. Are we ready to go to bed? Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Same time next year?
Got to go to Vancouver this week next year, but we'll come back the next.
Okay.
How's that?
We'll be here.